The golden light of morning spilled across the still surface of the lake, quiet and undisturbed, until a shocked murmur rose from a gathering of neighbors. A towering wooden fence 6 feet high and freshly bolted into place, now sliced clean through the once unified shoreline. It ran straight down the middle of what used to be open, shared lakefront. The division was brutal. Lawns split, dock halved, and the easy flow of summer mornings disrupted by a wall of treated timber. On one side of the fence, Margaret, Karen's cousin, stood frozen, her designer outdoor setup completely boxed in. Plush lounge chairs, her pricey sound system, and the jet ski ramp she proudly unveiled just weeks ago were now inaccessible. On the other side, I tightened the final bolt with steady hands, wiped the sweat from my brow, and gave the onlookers a casual wave. But let me take you back to how we arrived at this absurd moment. 5 years ago, I purchased what I considered my forever home in Willowbrook Estates. The biggest draw wasn't just the house. It was the guaranteed lakefront access that came with the deed. My property had legal rights to use a shared stretch of beach and dock, a privilege that my kids cherished. Every summer was a string of joyful weekends filled with swimming, fishing, and sunset barbecues. That lake wasn't just a body of water. It was our sanctuary. Everything began to unravel 6 months ago, when Karen Fitzgerald was elected president of our Homeowners Association. If you've ever seen someone drunk on power after being handed a teaspoon of authority, you know exactly what kind of president she became. Almost immediately, she began enforcing petty new rules. She handed out fines for slightly overgrown grass, banned wind chimes citing noise concerns, and insisted on written applications to plant flowers not listed on a bizarre, approved flora list. But her real skill lay in favoritism. Her brother-in-law became the HOA's official lawn inspector. Her childhood friend landed the pool maintenance contract. And when Margaret came to stay from out of state, things took a sharp turn. I first noticed the change one Tuesday morning. Margaret was on the shared lakefront, but she wasn't just lounging. She was orchestrating a full-scale takeover. Expensive chairs, tiki torches, blaring speakers, and workers setting up a jet ski ramp. It looked like a resort under construction. I walked down to introduce myself, keeping things cordial, and asked about the sudden transformation. She barely glanced at me. With an air of entitlement, she claimed Karen had granted her full access to that portion of the lake. According to her, my family only used it occasionally, and she needed it for her daily gatherings and book club socials. When I mentioned the lakefront was deeded shared property, she waved a printed document in my face and suggested I take it up with the HOA. The paper was something called an easement reassignment, dated just 3 days earlier. Supposedly, the HOA board had voted to give Margaret exclusive use of half the waterfront. The reasoning? To make better use of community assets. The vote was allegedly unanimous, except I knew 2 board members were out of the country that week. That didn't sit right. I reached out to the city's planning department and the county records office. Both confirmed what I suspected. The lakefront rights were deeded and could not be altered by an HOA vote. Any reassignment required agreement from every homeowner whose deed was affected. In short, Margaret's rights weren't worth the paper they were printed on. At the next HOA meeting, I calmly laid out the facts. Karen's reaction was telling. Her face flushed deep red as she clutched the podium and loudly claimed the board had amended its bylaws to manage lake access directly. She warned that I could be fined $500 a day for defying their ruling. She then held up another dubious piece of paperwork alleging the bylaw change had been passed in a mysterious meeting nobody could remember attending. Meanwhile, Margaret had turned the lake into her personal party zone. From sunrise to sundown, the air pulsed with bass from her speakers. Trash littered the grass, and the jet ski ramp now jetted out like an environmental hazard. The final blow came one morning when my 8-year-old daughter tried to go for a swim, only to be turned away by Margaret, who coldly told her this was now off-limits private space. That was it. As a contracts lawyer, I had the tools and now the motivation. I dove into every document I had. Purchase agreements, survey maps, HOA bylaws, and meeting records dating back 2 decades. What I uncovered was straightforward and devastating for them. The lake rights were irrevocably tied to specific lots, including mine. And not only was the HOA barred from changing those rights, but any attempt to do so opened them up to personal liability. I drafted a formal legal notice and served it to both Margaret and the HOA board. They had 72 hours to remove all unauthorized structures and restore full access, or face legal consequences. The following morning, Karen showed up at my door, red-faced and flanked by Margaret and a man who claimed to be their attorney. They came at me like amateurs trying to bluff their way through a courtroom drama. The supposed legal expert muttered something about squatters' rights and adverse possession. It was laughable. Karen, always theatrical, offered to waive my HOA dues if I just compromised. Margaret tried to bargain lake access every other Wednesday. I declined every offer with a smile, and when I showed them my own legitimate legal qualifications, they turned tail. Karen flung a parting threat over her shoulder, vowing I'd regret standing in her way. 72 hours passed without a peep, except Margaret doubling down. She hauled out even more patio furniture and began building a permanent sun shelter, as if she hadn't just been caught. That's when I rolled out the next step. I brought in a licensed land surveyor to officially mark where my property began and ended. The results weren't surprising to me, but they were damning for her. Turns out the shared lakefront was split precisely down the middle, and Margaret's setup sprawled well beyond her section. Armed with those findings, I made a trip to the local building supply shop. The teenage clerk blinked in surprise when I described how much fencing I'd need and where it was going. Word travels fast in towns like this. Before I even made it home, my phone was blowing up with curious neighbors. I told them the truth. I was just marking my legal property line. Nothing dramatic. At dawn the next day, I arrived with a professional fence crew, permits in hand and survey markers staked firmly in the soil. We got to work placing wooden panels in a clean, straight line that ran from the edge of the property, across the sand, sliced the dock in half and ended at the water. It was a work of art, if you appreciated symmetry and lawfulness. Just after 7 o'clock, Margaret stumbled out of her house, still in slippers, cradling a mug of coffee. She froze at the sight of her furniture being locked in on one side of the fence. The mug slipped from her hand and shattered on the ground as she let out a shriek that probably echoed into the next county. Karen wasn't far behind. She stormed over in her robe and hair curlers, dragging half the neighborhood behind her like a trail of shocked spectators. What followed was pure chaos. Karen screamed accusations, vandalism, harassment, even identity theft. She called the cops, who checked my permits, gave a nod and left. She tried the city inspector, same result. Then she went higher, calling the mayor's office, a congressman, maybe even the president if she had the number. Each call ended with her growing more hysterical. Meanwhile, Margaret's setup was falling apart. Her jet ski ramp was now split, one speaker from her fancy sound system on either side of the fence, and her shade structure unusable with support beams straddling the divide. Her workers quietly packed up and left as she stood there gaping. That evening's emergency HOA meeting was standing room only. Karen had already distributed flyers labeling me a menace to the neighborhood, destroying peace and property values. She stood at the podium, voice trembling with fury, demanding punishment and the immediate removal of the fence. But something had shifted. Other homeowners had clearly done their own homework. Tom Harrison, a calm retired judge, spoke first. He explained that the board had potentially exposed itself to real legal consequences. Then Sarah Chun shared her experience, how Karen's so-called beautification project had destroyed her garden. More neighbors chimed in, each with a story, each with facts. By the time the sixth person had spoken, it was clear the tide had turned. Karen's downfall gathered speed when Margaret's husband returned from out of state. One look at the mess, the fence, the broken construction, his wife in tears, and he decided then and there. They were packing up and leaving. As he supervised movers hauling their things, neighbors overheard him muttering that Karen had dragged them into a disaster, and he was done. Karen, in a final desperate gasp for control, stood up to declare an executive order, as HOA President, to take down the fence. That's when the board's lawyer, who had been quietly scribbling notes, stood and addressed the room. He said bluntly, she had no such power. Her actions had already endangered the HOA legally, and the board would need to act quickly to limit the damage. The vote was swift, unanimous. Karen was removed from her position on the spot. But her problems didn't end there. The board also agreed to pursue legal action for financial misconduct. Turns out she had used HOA funds, meant for legal matters, to prepare bogus documents for Margaret's easement. A forensic audit revealed more. She had been siphoning money from the landscaping budget by funneling payments to her brother-in-law for inflated, often fake, services. 3 months later, Karen stood in court, tears streaming as the judge delivered the verdict. Guilty of embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Her sentence: 2 years probation, 300 hours of community service, and repayment of $47,000 to the HOA. The judge noted the seriousness of her abuse of power for personal benefit. As the gavel fell, Karen collapsed into her lawyer's arms, finally realizing what her so-called leadership had cost her.